Good evening. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, even though that clock is a little slow. So we're going to get started tonight, and it's our town hall. We have a very, very, very special evening for you. But first, we want to thank Mitsu and Jean for greeting us. And Bertha Glassman for all the setup. I know she doesn't like this, but... And we have a couple of birthdays. And actually, I think some of them are in the audience tonight. We have Walter Saito. Right here. He's going to be 18 again. Right. Georgia Shaw. Where is she? Is she here? Carol Jones. Ryoko Narusawa. And June Sakaguchi. Ooh! She's actually older. She's going to be 19 again. And then Grace Xie. So please wish them happy birthday this next week when you see them. And now we're going to have Helen Greaves, who's going to introduce 2 new residents. Here you go, Helen. Stand up with me.
Good evening. We're so happy to introduce a brand new couple, and their names are Bennett and Elizabeth Cow. And they have moved here from, I thought it was Monterey Park, but it was the edge of Alhambra and Monterey Park. And so the address was Alhambra, and they have moved into Irving Terrace. And they're just getting settled. They moved in March and April, so they're getting settled. And they have 2 cats, Milo and Otis. So Elizabeth was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she's there were 5 children in the family, but she came to California at age 3. And so she had her schooling here. She graduated from UCLA, degree in biochemistry. But she is working in USC. She's been working there for 31 years. She's still at USC as a staff chemistry instructor. So she's a working gal. And Bennett was born in Honolulu, and he's the youngest of 3, and he attended the University of Hawaii, and then when he came here, he went to the San Jose State, and he's been in food business all of his life. His degree is in business marketing. So he had the wonderful opportunity of connecting with Wolfgang Puck and studying French baking in France. So he had his own bakery, his own French bakery here in L.A. Wholesale French pastries, and he did that work, the whole thing, until the turn of the century. So Bennett and Elizabeth met when her lab partner was teaching Chinese to an Italian friend of Bennett's, and that's what started the relationship. Now these 2 are accomplished ballroom dancers. And you will see a video of them performing next month in the variety show, so be sure to come. Great dancers. So now for fun, Elizabeth crochets and knits, and she would be willing to have a gathering of folks of like interest. So talk to her. Bennett does bonsai. He's got bonsai plants out there in the locked garden. He does landscaping and pruning, and he also does the French baking too. So we want to welcome them, but I want to ask if they want to say a few words.
Thank you. I want you to know Helen was the second resident I met here at Atherton. And I don't know why I want to cry, but I do. She was introduced to me by Cause. We were on our way to meet Brianna, and we were taking our own tour of the campus early, and she was coming out of Holy Grounds, and we were chatting with her, and then Helen came by, and like, you know, it's so easy to meet people here, and you guys are so friendly and so interesting and talented. It's been wonderful meeting you, and I can hardly wait to retire, spend more time here with you guys. And by the way, my phone number in the directory is incorrect, so I'm sorry a few couldn't reach me, but I called this morning and they said by mid-June they should be, the new directory should be out. I also brought a few copies in case anybody needed one right away. But I wanted to, one final thing to say, to keep it brief, is we brought a bonsai pomegranate tree over, and all the blossoms fell off. Like, oh well, no fruit this year. You should see all the blossoms. You know, it's so fertile here, okay? It's such a great place to live. Just like the pomegranate tree, you know, when do you get 2 rounds of blossoms in the same month, you know? So that's very symbolic to me. So anyway, thank you, everybody. I love being here.
You want to say anything? No. Let's welcome them again. Thank you.
Okay, like I said, it's a very special evening this evening. And as you know, Atherton is a place for senior living. So we have a lot of people here who have had long lives and very interesting lives. And here at Town Hall, we like to highlight individual people at certain times. Tonight is a special evening. We're going to be highlighting the life of Ping Ye and his family, who's all here. I think he brought at least 1,000 people. So, no, it's okay. And it's a story of a Chinese family in Libya going through some very interesting times. So Ping and Mary's daughter, Cindy, is going to give us a story of his life. Here you go, Cindy Ye.
It's on? Okay, can you all hear me? All right, thank you. And thank you, Hilda, for giving me this opportunity. Hilda and I actually went to the same graduate school at Johns Hopkins. And I ran into Hilda one time just walking in the courtyard here. So Hilda, thank you for everything you do for the Atherton community. As Hilda mentioned, my name is Cindy Ye. I am Ping and Mary's middle daughter. I'm from Virginia. And I came in here just to do this presentation and meet everyone. So, and this is my oldest sister, Julie. She lives in Santa Monica. And the youngest sister, Ivy, who's from Boston. And she came in here today for this as well. And on behalf of our family, my 2 sisters and my parents, and you mentioned you wanted to cry. I do too right now. Because I just want to thank everyone for being so welcome to my parents when they came here. My parents love it here. They moved in here in, yes, April 2000. No, 2020. April 2020, right before the pandemic. And they were so happy here, and it's because of all of you who made them feel so welcome. So thank you on behalf of us. And before I start to talk about our family in Libya, I want to introduce my cousin, Mindy, who's from Alhambra, and Rosie, who lives in Seal Beach. And let's see, Rosie's daughter, Jessica, Justine, who's here, and my brother-in-law, Jack, who's Julie's husband, and my parents' granddaughter, Eileen and Chloe. So our whole contingent is here to support us, to talk about my parents' life in Libya. So we're going to start. I think my sister will do the projector, and I prepared some notes. A lot of it will be family photos that's been taken through the years, and I interspersed it with things I took down from the internet, because I think the internet is all digital photos, and some of these old photos, as you can see, it is not digital. It is, what do you call those, film. So I had to copy them from film. So some of them are blurry, but I think it really shows our family life living in Libya. So let's start. Julie. Okay. I think the next slide. So I'll give you the cue, for next slide. Yes. This is a family. I think this was taken in 1973. Our family is just my parents, Ping and Mary, as well as the three of us. This is one of the early photos. Ping, next slide, please. Just to give everyone a little bit lay of the land, the geography and history of Libya. Libya is in North Africa and borders Egypt, Tunis, Algeria, and Sudan, Chad, and Niger in the south. Let's see, it is 600, go back. It's 680,000 square miles, but most of it consists of desert. And 2/3 of the population lived near the Mediterranean coast, because it's mostly desert. So it's really uninhabitable except by the Mediterranean coast. When we were there in the 1960s and 70s, it was only 3 million people. But now Libya's population is 6 million. So it's still a very small population, but it is a fairly large geography, 680,000 square miles. Next slide. Libya is a Muslim country. So this was the Grand Mosque in Tripoli. It was converted from a cathedral, actually. Julie, next slide. Libya, just a little bit of a history. Libya was occupied by the Italians from 1912 to 1943. And then it was under British and French occupation from 1943 to 1951. In World War II, Italy was allied with Germany. So they were fighting in the Libyan desert. Some of you may know the name, the German commander, Erwin Rommel. He fought in Libya because Germany sided with Italy at that time. So there was fighting in the Libyan desert. But after World War II, in 1951, because of course Germany and Italy were on the losing side, the United Nations established the independent nation of Libya and placed King Idris on the throne. King Idris sided with the British. So as the winning side, Idris was put on the throne. He was very unpopular, but because he sided with the British, he was put on the throne. And this was the palace. This was the actual photo I think my parents took where King Idris lived in Tripoli. So it wasn't a very extravagant palace, but it was the palace where he lived in. So in the 1950s and 60s, when my parents first went to Libya, it was still under, it was a kingdom. Libya was a kingdom. This was all pre-Gaddafi years. So why we were there? In 1950, oil was discovered in Libya, and everything changed. Before then, Libya was Libya was one of the poorest nations in the world. This was before oil. But then oil was discovered, and then Libya needed technicians and help for them to develop the country. As a result, my father went there as well. Libya actually hired, they invited people with technical skills to go out to help them develop. So there were people from, from Britain, the Americans, Egyptians, Palestinians, Lebanese. They were all in Libya to help Libya develop, because Libya was one of the poorest nations in the 1950s. As a result, my parents went as well. So this was where my parents' story began. So they were married in 1962 in Taiwan. My parents, Ping and Mary, were both born in China. But then in 1949, after the Communist Revolution, they moved to Taiwan and started their life in Taiwan. They were really young when they went to Taiwan. And they got married there. And then this was in the 1960s. My dad, actually, in 1959, came to the United States and received a degree at the U.S. Army Signal School in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. That's how he became a telecommunications engineer. He was sent by the Taiwan government in 1959 to go to the United States. That's where he got his engineering telecommunications degree. And at that time, as I mentioned, Libya was doing better because of oil, and Libya was actually doing better than Taiwan in the early 1950s, which is really hard to imagine right now with where Taiwan is economically. So my father signed on to go to Libya to help Libya develop its telecommunications system. My father was always very, very interested in traveling. So in 1959, he went out, as I mentioned, he just came to the United States to study. But he decided to go to Libya because at that time, Taiwan government send people, send engineers and farmers and doctors all over the world. But Libya was the only country where you can bring a family. And my father wanted to bring his family. So he chose Libya, to go to Libya to help them build out its telecommunications system. So as a result, my father went. This was one of the early photos with the 2 other Taiwan engineers, and they were dispatched to Libya. And here's my mother with Julie, my sister Julie, as a baby. And in those days, you take photographs when you get on an airplane because people did not travel. So this was one of the early photos of Julie traveling with my mother to Libya. I think this was the actual flight. And this was my mother. I think she was probably in her mid-20s. And with Julie, this is early 1960s. And next one. And then the family grew. That was me. I was born in Libya. I was born in Tripoli, and that is my father, Ping. The next slide, please. And that was me as a baby. And I think it was black and white. And then eventually, my younger sister, Ivy, was born. So this became our family. There's 3 girls. That's us in Tripoli, Libya. Julie, next slide. And life in Libya in the 1960s, it was very idyllic. It was slow. It was by the Mediterranean. There wasn't a lot of stress. I just remember we went to the beach almost every weekend because our house was very close to the Mediterranean. So as you can see, in my memory, I was at the beach all the time. There wasn't a lot of things to do in Libya. So we went to the beach, and here's a picture of the Bedouins. And you find this quite often in Libya in the early 1960s, the Bedouins with their camels and with their goats and sheep just walking through the village. And this was a typical photo. So this was us, my parents, and my sister Julie probably was 2 years old at that time. Julie, next one. And this just a little bit of geography. Libya, as I mentioned, it's in North Africa. So the Romans and Greeks were there for 2,000 years ago. This was one of the trade route. Libya was a very strategic trade route for the Romans and the Greeks. Tripoli is on the western side of Libya. I just wanted to show this photo because many of you here will know in the New Testament, when Jesus was on his way to the cross, Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus carry the cross. And Simon of Cyrene is actually in modern-day Libya. Of course, it wasn't called Libya then, it was Cyrene. And Simon of Cyrene is from the eastern side of Libya, close to modern-day Benghazi. So this was another little reference about Libya. So next one. And Libya actually has some of the best preserved antiquities in the world outside of Rome. It has some of the best amphitheaters outside of Rome because of the Greek and Roman history. So this is a temple of Zeus in Cyrene. Look how complete it is. And Julie, next slide. This is just a photo of our old car going through the desert, going to see some of these temples. And it has really look at some of the best archaeological sites from antiquities. And this is Theater of Sabratha. Sabratha, I think, the Phoenicians occupied it. And next one, this is us in, I think, my parents with Julie again, climbing some of these temples. It was very empty, as you can see. It wasn't very well preserved. Nobody monitored it. At least when we were there, I just remember they allowed us to climb on all these ancient monuments. And at least when we were there, we didn't remember hearing about looting of antiquities. But I think it has happened now, just because it is not very well controlled. So this is another photo of us when we were young there. Julie, you can show. And this is Leptis Magna. This was the Romans. Cyrenaica was built by the Greek. These were all built by the Romans. And you can see how well it is preserved. The amphitheater and the Mediterranean Sea is right in the background. Yeah, and because Libya didn't really develop its tourism industry, so some of these sites are empty, even if you go there today. Actually, I should ask people, if you have any questions, please, if you want to raise your hand, you can ask me any questions now, or I can take questions at the end. No? You have one? No? Okay. So feel free to ask me questions as we go along. I think the next photo, Leptis Magna, this is just a typical Roman sculpture, Roman monument. My dad and Julie again. Okay, Julie, next slide. And this is just one of the marble statues in the Libyan Museum. This is like the three graces of the Romans developed these. And now I'm going to go to Tripoli. As I mentioned, majority of the population lives along the coast, especially Tripoli. Tripoli is the capital city, and we lived in Tripoli as well. Majority of the foreigners, international guests, all lived in Tripoli on the western side of Libya. And this is a picture of a downtown Libyan harbor. This is the Arch of Marcus Aurelius. So a lot of the Roman monuments were just, dotting throughout the landscape in Tripoli. Julie, the next slide. I want to throw this in on history, because United States actually has several interactions with Libya throughout history. In 1801, United States actually sent their Navy to fight pirates in the coast of Libya. At that time, of course, it's not called Libya. It was just called the coast of Tripoli. And it was to fight pirates. I think they called the corsairs at that time, in Barbary Coast. The United States sends the USS Philadelphia to destroy the pirates, because the pirates were engaged in, I think, the slave trade was going on, as well as just looting. So U.S. sent the USS Philadelphia, but it was destroyed. The USS Philadelphia was destroyed. And in 1801, it was sent by, I looked it up, President Thomas Jefferson ordered USS Philadelphia to go to Tripoli to put down the pirates. And this was the battle was commemorated in the Marine Corps hymn, To the Shores of Tripoli. It's because of this battle. And unfortunately, USS Philadelphia was destroyed, but eventually, I think USS Constitution, that ship came to rescue the crew members. And USS Constitution, of course, is still around. It's in Boston Harbor, for many of you may have visited. And I want to show this, Julie, next slide, is because the mast here, this is in Tripoli, the mast here, this is the mast of the USS Philadelphia. It's prominently displayed in Libyan Harbor. And this was the museum in Libya, the archaeological museum, and this was the mast of the USS Philadelphia. So, Julie. And this is a photo my dad actually took in the 1960s. This is the same. This is called the Red Castle. And along the waterfront here, we've walked many, many hours, spent our time just walking in the beachfront on the Mediterranean. Okay, next slide. No, so this is hard to imagine, but United States actually had an Air Force base in Tripoli at one point, right after World War II. It was the largest U.S. military facility outside of the United States. At one point, it was actually in Tripoli, Libya. It was called Wheelus Air Force Base. I included some of these photos because I just think it's fascinating to see the planes taking off with the camels right next to it. And this wasn't that old. This was in the 1950s and 60s. These were actual photos. Julie, next slide. And the Wheelus Air Force Base has a beach club. It has a military hospital. It has a movie theater, all for the Americans living there. And I think the school, there was, before that, Julie, the school had about 500 American students. And I read somewhere stories from the airmen who flew in and out of Wheelus Air Force Base. And they all mentioned, Libya had 364 days sunshine. The weather was lovely for them to fly, except sometimes the wind, the desert wind that comes in, makes maintenance hard for them. But they all were in Libya. Next slide. We attended the oil company school in Tripoli. It's the American school founded by the oil company. I think you're nodding your head, so you may have heard a lot of the, because Libya has oil, and the Americans were there to help extract oil for Libya. And the American workers there needed a place for their families and their spouse, their families to attend school. So the oil company started a school. It eventually became an international school, but it was called the Oil Company School. And it was founded by oil companies like Atherton, I think Hess, and Oasis Company. Eventually, I think it became ExxonMobil. Those were all the oil companies. They founded the school. So the three of us all attended the oil company school in Tripoli. Next slide, please. And I found an old yearbook of mine in 1979. It prominently displayed the map of Libya, and also the yearbook is Cyrenaica. So it was, now looking back, it was just the ruins were just so very important for everybody living in Tripoli. We all went out there to visit the ruins. And our yearbook was called The Ambassador. And this is a photo of my dad, my father. Most of the foreigners live in the capital, Tripoli, but because of my father's work, because he is a telecommunications engineer sent by the Taiwan government, he worked in the Libyan army to help set up the telecommunications system. So he traveled all over the country, not just in Tripoli. He traveled to the desert, he traveled all through the country. And it was actually really hard work because it could be like 110 degrees at times in the desert. But he was out there to establish the telecommunications system. Next slide. And this is a photo of my dad. In fact, this man was the Libyan ambassador to United States. Muhammad is Mr. Modify. I remember him very well. He was very friendly with my father, and he was the ambassador to the United States in the early 80s. Julie, next slide. These are just some of the photos of my father's work with the Libyans. They go to the beach, same like we all go to the beach, fishing. Julie, next slide. Picnic in the desert. These are just some of the photos of my father's life while he was there. They spoke Arabic, and my father spoke Arabic because of his work. He had to learn. He had to learn Arabic. And also the three of us had to learn Arabic as well, even though we went to American school. But we also learned Chinese at home. So there's a small Chinese community sent from Taiwan in the 1960s and 70s. There were about 200 Taiwanese families sent from Taiwan living in Libya. In the 1960s, of course, Libya had diplomatic relations with Taiwan instead of China. China was still going through the Cultural Revolution, so there were no diplomatic relations anywhere, I think, at that time. So Taiwan was the official representative, Republic of China. So, we had like 200 families. This was the ambassador. There was all kinds of like formal ceremonies. We learned Chinese in the afternoon. During the daytime, we went to American schools, but in after schools, we learned to speak Chinese. And of course, it was taught by mothers. The moms were teaching everybody how to speak Chinese, read and write Chinese, so that's how we learned how to speak Chinese. It was a very small community, of course, playing mahjong, even my parents. In those days, everywhere we go, Chinese people would play mahjong. My parents were there, and that's my father with Ivy. Ivy was like 4 or 5 years old watching them play. So this was a very small community. Everybody knows everyone's business. So it was good and bad. And I just think another life there. There was no alcohol. Libya didn't have alcohol. It was a Muslim country, so everybody made alcohol at home. So that's something I remember. Moonshine, that was very common. Amongst the Americans, as well as Chinese, British, everybody made their own alcohol. And another thing that I remembered was also traveling. My parents traveled everywhere. They were living in the because they were in Libya. It was very easy to travel to Europe. So this was a photo of my dad. I think this was in the Tivoli Gardens in Rome, Julie. And this was them again with another engineer. This must be in Rome or somewhere. Rome again. And in those days, when people travel, they wear suit and tie, which is kind of interesting too. Julie, can you go? And this was in Venice. Of course, the pigeons in Venice, Julie. And my mother traveled with him as well. This was my mother, and my sister Julie probably was 2 years old. This is Venice. And it's just amazing to see how empty it is compared to the amount of tourists these days. I know, Hilda, you were just in Italy. It must be packed. Yeah. Yes, it must be packed in Italy now, but even then, but in the 1960s, people did not travel as much. This was in Barcelona, okay, with my father and Julie. This was us as we slightly get older. We were in Rome, I think this was in the 70s. Same thing, look at those cars. So it was so much fun when I was preparing this presentation to pull out all these old photographs and look at how empty. And we traveled a lot. As I mentioned, we went to Tunisia. It was right across the border, so we drove across the desert to go to Tunisia. And my mother was a cover girl at one point. This was 1973. For some of you who read Chinese may know, the traveling magazine in 1973. Travel for tourism was in the early nascent stage, especially for people from Taiwan. They didn't travel that much. But because my mother traveled, she wrote an article about her travels, and they put her the cover with a beef eater. This was 1973. So now, to the interesting stuff. Our life, of course, was influenced by Gaddafi as well. I think before Gaddafi, even during Gaddafi's reign, our family had a very nice life there. In the 1960s to 1970, Libya was just, as I mentioned, very idyllic. It was very peaceful, not a heck of a lot going on. But in September 1st, 1969, Muammar Gaddafi, he was a colonel at that time. He was 27 years old. He had a coup. He overthrew King Idris. King Idris was in Greece at that time undergoing medical treatment. So he was out of the country. Gaddafi started the revolution. And in many ways, resentment was already building. I mentioned earlier, Libya was all the foreigners controlled Libya, was in all the top positions in the bureaucracy. The British, the Americans controlled the oil industries. So there was a lot of anti-Western feelings. And also, I think, 1967, when the Six-Day War broke out, many Libyans were angry at the Western countries. So it was ripe for the revolution. They were just very resentful of the West controlling its oil industries. So Gaddafi really took advantage of that sentiment and started the revolution in September 1st, 1969. My father, as I mentioned, was a telecommunications engineer working for the Libyan army at that time. Gaddafi was just a young soldier in the army base, so he knew my father very well. He was just a young soldier, nothing unique about him. So when the September 1st this was a funny story. When the revolution happened, September 1st, 1969, my father was a telecommunications engineer, and another Chinese engineer was out in another city, Benghazi. Gaddafi told my father to send a signal to Benghazi in Chinese. Nobody understands it. They were communicating in Chinese. Unbeknownst to my father, it was a signal to start their revolution. Yeah, my father actually played a role in Gaddafi's revolution, unbeknownst to him. And then because after the signal was sent on September 1st, 1969, Gaddafi told my father to shut down all the communication system in the country. My father installed it, so he shut it down. And that actually prevented the king's security personnel to come rescue the king. So that essentially stopped the king's security personnel to come counter Gaddafi's revolution. So as a result, the king, as I said, was outside of the country. In exchange for the safety of his family and his own safety, he gave up power. As a result, Gaddafi, at 27 years old, took over the country, and it was a bloodless coup. Literally, it happened like 2 days. Everything just fell apart. So Gaddafi became the official leader of Libya. And he was just a 27-year-old army captain. And then I think he eventually made himself a colonel and stopped at that. He never made himself a general. He just stopped at being a colonel, even though he held all the power of the country. So in 1960, that all happened in 1969. And of course, these were some of the Chinese articles written about my dad's work at that time. This is a Chinese translation, China Times article titled, "The Libya You Did Not Know." The articles talk about my father's work in Libya and how it contributed. It played a little part in Gaddafi's revolution. Julie, next. And my father's work in Libya, actually, because he knew all the Libyan revolutionary officers, and this was the Prime Minister Jalud when he was really young. He knew my father. My father knew them. They were all working together. How about the next slide? And this just shows these. I think this was probably in the 1970s, right after the revolution. Gaddafi was very young, but he was idealistic. He wanted the vision of pan-Arabism, where the Arabs can all work together to unite. Essentially, it was anti-Western. And his hero was Nasser from Egypt. That was his hero. He really wanted to work together with Nasser. But I'm not a political expert, but I was told that Nasser was not that impressed with him. So didn't embrace Gaddafi as much as he would like. And as you go through, and then as the years go by, Gaddafi became radicalized, and he militarized the country, and he aligned himself with every dictator around the world for really no particular reason. So this is like with Fidel Castro of Cuba, Idi Amin of Uganda. All of these were, not the best, not the most savory characters, but Gaddafi aligned himself. And that was from Syria, Assad of Syria. And that, of course, was Sadat, that's right. So he became radicalized through the 70s and 80s. Go through. And then he eventually banned all Western television, Western movies, and he started erecting all these type of posters throughout the country of his own features, of his own pictures. So these are all memories, we all remember. Everywhere we go in downtown Tripoli, it has his posters of his. And this is just life. And every year, September 1st, it's to commemorate the revolution, his revolution. So there was always parade. I remember going to see these. Julie, next slide. And parade of the tanks going through Libya. And he eventually stopped putting his face on all the stamps to commemorate the revolution. And he put his face on currencies as well. And finally, this is the final slide. Just shows, Julie, before you can go back a little bit. In the 80s, relationship between U.S. and Libya deteriorated. Wheeler's Air Force Base was eventually abandoned, and the Soviets moved in and ended up using that Air Force base. My mother took the three of us to the United States in the early 1980s, and my father worked there for a few more years, and he moved to the United States in 1983 as well. Because we went to American school, so my parents always knew we will be emigrating to the United States. As a result, we went to American schools. So we left Libya in 1980s. And I think many of you may remember in the 1980s, Gaddafi was implicated in several very high-profile terrorists, like the bombing activities in Berlin, where several U.S. military personnel was killed. And in 1986, Reagan ordered the bombing of Tripoli. We have already left at that time, but we still had a lot of friends living there. They lived through that. And 2006, diplomatic relations was restored with America. And in 2011, Gaddafi was killed after 40 years being a dictator in his own country. Our memories of Libya was very, very sweet. We were young at that time. My father was working there. We had a very close-knit community. Living there, we went to international schools. There was a very nice Chinese community. So our memories of Libya was very, very positive. Even we knew, well, I don't know, maybe we were young. I'm sure that there was human rights violations by Gaddafi, but we weren't affected by it. So our memories of Libya was very sweet. And as mentioned, Libya, Gaddafi was always very nice to the Chinese community. He was always very thankful for what my father did for him during the revolution. So he was always very, very nice to us. In fact, years later, and this is a photograph, he awarded my father with these gold watches. He likes to put his face on some of these watches. I brought it. I think we brought it over there to show and tell. People can take a look at it. And I think this particular watch, he only had issued 12 of them, and my father got one of them. Gaddafi wanted to thank my father for all the work he has done for him. So that was our life in Libya before we came out here in the early 80s. But my father worked there for more than 20 years, and we lived there all this time. So I hope this gives everyone a little background of my parents' life living in Libya. So, and feel free to ask any questions to me or my sisters.
Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to give you the microphone so that those who are watching on closed circuit TV can also hear your questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Sure. Oh, there's one.
So I want to know what your citizenship is now. With all the countries you've been, some were born here and there. What is your citizenship?
We are Americans now. But interesting, yeah, my younger sister and I were born in Libya. So we have like Libyan birth certificate. But Libya does not give out citizenship to foreigners. So we never received Libyan citizenship. But we have American citizenship.
Yes. You mentioned that Libya is a Muslim country. Were you influenced by Islamic lifestyle, or were you required to do anything like that?
No. Libya was a Muslim country, but it was secular. The government was secular. It wasn't like Saudi Arabia, where women have to cover up, women can't drive. Libya was completely different. Women can go to the beach. My mom drove us to the beach all the time. So it was a secular country, even though Islam was the official religion. But, when we were there were underground churches. So we attended churches. People held church services at home. Just don't do it openly. No, Libya was okay with it. And I think like for Islam, were we really influenced by it? I don't think they forced that on any residents there, because it was really a secular country. The government was secular.
Question. How about traveling to Libya today? Is it safe?
It's hard to say. I know American embassy officials, who are diplomats in Libya right now. they tend to stay in their compound. They don't go out. But it's definitely not as dangerous as, I would say, Afghanistan or Iraq. They were not like living in the green zone. They still live amongst the American community, but it is not as dangerous. But I'm not sure whether, you have to go with a tour now. That's what my sister said. You can't go travel by yourself. And Libya never really developed its tourism industry, which is a shame because Libya has such wonderful, ruins from the antiquities, the Greek and Roman ruins, but they never really developed it. As a result, it's actually kind of empty. So people who want to go there now, they can see like lovely sights without a lot of, just people there.
Questions? If
Yes,
not,
please.
oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, Bertha.
Was Tripoli very popular at one time when they were making a lot of movies about, they made it very beautiful, Tripoli, and
It could be. I'm not 100% sure of that. Okay, the movie English Patient, if anyone remembers that, that was filmed in Libya. And there's some books there. We put some books about the Libyans' antiquities, and I left and also stamps, just really interesting stamps that our families collected through the years of life living there, life there. Yes, please.
What is the government of Libya like now?
Yeah, I think so. It was decentralized after Gaddafi fell, after he was killed in 2011. It's just decentralized with different factions trying to fight to control the country. So it's unstable right now. I don't think it has a strong central government. Gaddafi essentially ruled the country with an iron fist. That's how he reunited the country. Oh, okay. All right. You'd read that, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to say that Gaddafi's son, Saif, and then as well as King Idris's descendant, is also vying for power.
Right.
In this whole battle.
But
too.
I doubt the
It's-
monarchy can ever come back. It just doesn't have the tradition anymore. I think I saw another hand. Yes.
A small question, but was there any difficulty in leaving the country? I think that if I were, Gaddafi, I would try to limit immigration, but you just got a passport and left?
We left. We didn't have any trouble at that time. I know in 1986, when Reagan was about to bomb Libya, he ordered all the Americans to leave. And in the 1970s, there were more than 10,000 Americans actually living in Libya. But then as the political situation worsened, more and more Americans left. A lot of the oil fields were replaced by Canadian workers. And then eventually it was replaced like by Egyptians and, from other nationalities. But we didn't have any issues in 1980s to leave there. And now, actually, I live in Virginia, in the Washington area, so there was quite a lot of, I run into the Libyan in the diplomatic corps in Washington area. Hi, Daryl. How are you? Sorry to put you to get everyone to notice you walking in here. So are they? Yes, there's another hand.
You had mentioned Benghazi, and I wonder when that episode happened there, if any of your friends were affected by that.
No, we have left at that time. I know this was, I think, in 2000. Yeah, the American ambassador at that time was killed by rioters. We did not have any friends by that point. But yeah, that was really just a very tragic incident. And just at that time, I think it was because Gaddafi was already captured. Oh, he was killed in 2011. The country just went into chaos, and that's why the ambassador was killed. Anything else? We'll be around here too to answer any questions.
Well, let's give a hand to the Ye family for being here. Thank you, guys. Now, if you would like, there's some books over here, as Cindy had mentioned, and Julie had mentioned. There's a stamp book here. There's a book you could just peruse about the lost cities of the Roman Empire, illustrations. And if you want to take a look at these watches, now, no pilfering. These watches are here, so you can just go ahead and take a look at them. Okay? They're pretty unique. So, thank you all very much for coming tonight, and have a good rest of your evening.